afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Kevin Riley, for those who know me, and many of you. We are delighted to have Barbara Gellman-Danley here, who heads the HLC, the regional accrediting body for, I always like to say this part of the country, but we were talking last night, and you go down to Arizona and
West Virginia,
Colorado, so it's really a misnomer to talk about the North Central Association and the Higher Learning Commission. Well, let me tell you a few things about Barbara. So Barbara took this job as the president of the Higher Learning Commission on July 7, 2014. And the statement that she made upon taking the job, I think is very interesting. I'll just say one or two words about that in part of the introduction. So she said this: "It will be an honor to serve the Higher Learning Commission as president, the institutions in the region, and the most important stakeholder, the students." Boom, hot button number one pressed, right? "I embrace the accreditor's role in quality assurance." For me, boom, that's hot button number two. It's about quality. That's the main mission of what our regional accreditors do and should be doing. So I embrace the accreditor's role in quality assurance and the emerging focus on outcomes-based assessment. Hot button number three. Everybody wants to say we're not just looking at inputs. We're trying to get closer to determine what students really learn, what effect we have at the other end of the pipeline on their lives and regional economies and everything else. And she went on to say, "This includes a respect for the peer review process." Essential point, again, that this is a voluntary peer review operation that she's running, and the important issues raised by the public and our congressional leaders on accreditation. So recognizing, on the one hand, the sort of voluntary, internal, collegial peer review nature of what accreditors do, but recognizing on the other hand that the public and Congress especially is watching like a hawk these days. Those external forces are very real and peering in very sharply. And she went on to conclude, "We can all work collaboratively." Another really important word. This should be about collaboration, and she'll talk a little bit about the triad, I'm sure, and some of those kinds of historical collaborations. "To assure the United States is a leader in higher education through all sectors of the academy." So another important point, that accreditation deals with all of the degree granting institutions in a region. So prior to joining the commission, Barbara was the president of the University of Rio Grande Community College from 2009 to 2014. She's also served as vice chancellor at the Ohio Board of Regents, which is a coordinating board in the state of Ohio, as president of Antioch University McGregor, one of the interesting original sort of non-traditional institutions, private. She's been vice president at Monroe Community College, which is one of the largest community colleges in the SUNY system, Rochester, New York. And she's been vice chancellor at the Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Education, which is really more of a governing board, we'd say, right, than a coordinating board in Oklahoma. And her past involvement with the commission includes serving as a peer reviewer for 10 years. Barbara holds a Bachelor of Science from Syracuse University, a Master of Library Science from Simmons College, a Master of Business Administration from Oklahoma City University, and a PhD in Communication from the University of Oklahoma. So one of the interesting things when you think about that background is the number of different kinds and levels of institutions and systems and coordinating boards that Barbara has experience with. And I think the job she holds now, having to deal with all of those different kinds of entities in the accreditation process in all of these different states is really, really valuable. So Barbara and I go way, way back to when she was at Monroe Community College and I was with the New York State Board of Regents and in the SUNY system, and she's always been a good friend and an innovative thinker, and Barbara's a person who has moxie. So you need moxie in these jobs, and that's a good thing that she has it. So again, we're delighted that you're here, and we look forward to chatting with you.
Thank you very much. Could we do a quick run around the table, name, title, or student and major?
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Jason Lee. I'm with WISCAPE. So thanks for coming and nice to see you all.
Hi, I'm Carrie Dickinson and I'm also from WISCAPE.
I'm Jocelyn Donaldson and I am a master's student in Alpha.
My name is Kelly Haslam. I'm an assistant dean in the graduate school. is Rachel, and I'm with WISCAPE. I'm also a student. I'm an English major.
English major, did you say?
I'm Steve Kramer, Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning.
Mo Bischoff, Associate Vice Provost, Provost.
Elaine Klein, Assistant Dean for Academic Planning, Program Review and Assessment in the College of Letters and Science.
Sarah Kuban, Academic Planner with Academic Planning and Institutional Research.
Joss Miller, Associate Provost and Director of Academic Planning and Institutional Research. And students may find, I'm the HLC liaison.
Let me ask you, are you comfortable with me sitting? Would you like me to stand? Either way is fine. You can see me all right, hear me?
Yeah.
All right, so it's really a pleasure to be here. Kevin and I do go back to when we were both younger, and we had some great experiences, and I think we learned early on into our careers in higher education that it is a very political environment. I had a former father-in-law say to me, well, when I was 22, at least if you're going into higher education, you don't have to worry about politics. And something in me at that age said, I don't think that's true. So we have a great deal of influencers, individuals who have opinions about how to do our jobs, etc. Let me talk about the challenges, as you said, in voluntary accreditation. There are challenges. A brief history, I'll talk a little bit more when I go to the class I will be attending at 1:30, but in higher education, there are a few acts that really made a difference to us, and they were the GI Bill Act, the other returning veterans acts, and that Pell Grants began, and then also the Higher Education Act. The Higher Education Act is supposedly reauthorized every 5 years, but due to political reasons, it drags out. So that 5-year authorization is often done in the 6th year or 6.5 or whatever. They try to keep it close. And it's very influenced by parties. So when the Democrats started their work on the higher ed reauthorization this past year, or before that even, they went in a certain direction, and now the Republicans are in place and they want to take it in a very different direction. And we just participate as appropriate. The value of regional accreditation is we are not-for-profit private organizations. And there are 7 regionals. There used to be 6. There are 7 regionals, and they are, we have 1,010 institutions in the Higher Learning Commission, previously named the North Central Association, and then we added Higher Learning Commission, and now we're just Higher Learning Commission because we have signed the paperwork for dissolution of the North Central arrangement. The other half of North Central is CASI, which stands for schools, K through 12. We can cooperate. We don't have to be a formal organization. There's nothing hostile here. It's just we can't find the means to have to work together or sense of it anymore in a formal, legalized way. So the Higher Learning Commission, been around a number of years, started in the late 1800s. In fact, between about 1875 and 1895, 4 of the 7 regionals were formed. In California, there are 2 regionals, one for the universities and one for the community college. There are 2 in the Northeast. One is literally called Northeast Association. The one is Middle States, but Middle States is as misleading as ours is because Middle States includes New York State. And I guess if you mean the middle of the East Coast, perhaps, but not really. So, and then the second largest, they all have a couple hundred institutions. The second largest is the Southern Association. And then there's another one called Northwest, and that includes not only the 48 states, but beyond. So in our case, we cover Arizona through West Virginia, and all the way up, as said, Colorado. And I like to say we've got a big part of the Big 10 and a big part of the Big 12, which neither case is 10 or 12, by the way, of course. Our institutions range from large institutions such as the University of Wisconsin to many that are small private institutions. Some are elite small privates and some are just very good in their region, not so good. They do their job. They're there for the purpose of serving a region as more than necessarily taking in out-of-state students. But they are private institutions. And we have a substantial amount of community colleges, including very large community college. I think the largest or one of the two, they're always kind of battling between one in Miami and this, Maricopa Community Colleges. We have the Pima Community College District, both in Arizona. And for those of you who are not aware, community colleges or districts are made up either of colleges or campuses, and that depends on how their leadership and how they operate. In some cases, like in North Dakota, there is a coordinating board, but we never accredit coordinating boards. We don't accredit the Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Education. We do not accredit the North Dakota State University system. We accredit the individual institutions. In some cases, it's a joint accreditation within a district. In some cases, it's individualized. In Ohio, for example, Kent State has a campus that's a branch campus that's separately accredited. So it's all over the map. You can imagine that it's a very complex environment within which we operate based on this. So we're dealing with, when we say 1,010, we're dealing with 1,010 and or plus branch campuses, et cetera. The staff is very small, 55 individuals, and hundreds of peer reviewers. So to talk about that part briefly, of course, the key focus of accreditation is quality assurance. That terminology, quality, was in there from day one. As Kevin alluded to, we got a lot of accusations of counting the books in the library. And in fact, that was true. There were days when it used to be called consultant evaluators, just a different title, would come to the campus, and literally you would have to say how many books are in the library. I believe asking if you are ACRL, in other words, Associated College and Research Libraries for a university this size, is much more relevant than how many books do you have in the library. And certainly with the change in technology, how many books you have in the library is somewhat irrelevant because they're not all here, right? You're getting them from all kinds of places. But the peer review system is based on hundreds of volunteers who have expertise. And let me pause to say, how many of you in here have ever been peer reviewers? Okay, and anybody ever been a peer reviewer for NCATE or any specialized accreditor? Okay, so just to explain, there are many specialized accreditors. Now, you're in education or you're in an educational institution, but when I say this to the layperson, this is not an elevator speech, we're working on it. But the idea is that people would recognize AMA, the American Medical Association, or the Dental Association. If you're a teacher, you recognize what used to be called NCATE and is now CAPE. So you know that there's this kind of sacred time where you say, we got to get ready, NCATE's coming, or AMA, or ABA for law, engineering, ABET. I'm not going to bore you naming all of them. I think I might pass the quiz, though. So radiology and others. Those are very specific. And in many cases, they're competency-based, different standards, and they're very focused on that discipline. In addition to that, you have regional accreditors. And the regional accreditors, there are 7, as I mentioned. Our job is to look at the whole institution. So for example, when something happens where an institution gets either everything's okay or there's a problem with a specialized accreditor, we are always copied. So if a nursing program's in trouble, we're copied. That becomes part of our own review to recognize there's a red flag. And I never want to name institutions, but there are whole institutions that have really suffered because their nursing program lost their accreditation, or their education program was on probation, because we talked about other things that can influence admissions, but it is a good idea to make sure you go to a school that has a proper accreditation. Here you would be AACSB accredited for business. That's the highest level. But education and business, about at the same time, set up a couple different accreditors because they were concerned about the standards being able to be met of the higher level accreditation. Education merged back into one, but in the case of a business, there are 3. And you could say you're accredited, but you may want to make a decision as to whether you're accredited at the right level. What does it really mean? And there are some institutions, including Harvard, who say, we're not even going to go for those accreditations because they're too easy. And I remember when I had my kids in school in a suburb of Rochester, New York, Brighton, very good school district. And they basically opted out of the state regents exams because they thought they were too easy. Whereas other districts, I grew up in Niagara Falls, thought they were brutal. It's a matter of what resources you have in your schools or your colleges. So we've got all these specialized accreditors. We have the regional accreditors, and then there are also national accreditors. And the national accreditors, for example, there is one just for distance learning. And there are institutions that will go for that national accreditation and won't go for the regional. What is important is if you are recognized, and recognized by these accrediting, to be accredited, and therefore critically important, a conduit to federal financial aid, Title IV, you have to be recognized by two organizations. One is CHIA, the Council on Higher Ed Accreditation. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And the other is the U.S. Department of Education. So we don't operate in isolation. We didn't set up this group and nobody bothers us and we do what we want. It's quite the contrary. In fact, it's become more of a intrusion, to be frank, in the last 5 or 6 years. So what happens is the CHIA accreditation is within our collegeship. This is an organization made up by education folks. There may be some public members, but predominantly people who really understand higher education. And they have criteria, and every so many years, 5 to 10 years, it's usually about 10, you can go in and you do the standards and you meet with them. But let me give you an example. In the case of the Higher Learning Commission, there was one area there they wanted us to have a policy. They delayed the recognition for a year. We got the policy in place and we were recognized. So it wasn't really a matter of there was a big problem. It was a matter of we think this is important. And
I'm just going to add there, Barbara, so folks
yeah.
know John Wiley was the chair of the CHIA board for several years while he was chancellor here.
That's very important. So you have people who get it, okay? When it comes to the U.S. Department of Education, there are indeed educators there. There are people there who've been past presidents. We have somebody there, the past president of Skidmore College, very prestigious. But in many cases, the folks in the trenches have absolutely no exposure to higher education, which is always a challenge for us because we do speak educationese, all right? So the world that we live in, we have our own vernacular, we have our own way that we work with each other. And one of the biggest pressures is on the peer reviewer team reports all becoming public. Now, you're a public institution, so it can happen anyway. But let me explain this. The way the peer reviewers work, I really consider them servant leaders because the funds that they get to go to an institution is so nominal compared to what they would get if they were consultants or, in business or anything like that. So I remember when I did it, it started at $50 a day, and then I think it went to $200 for a day or for a visit or whatever. And I, at the time, certainly was consulting and had a different fee than that. Why do you do it? Why would you do a peer reviewer? What does it take? Well, as you know, those of you who've been peer reviewers, it's very good to know what's going on in a visit because then when you're visited, you're more knowledgeable, okay? I wouldn't think it's fair to say that's the number one motivation, but it's certainly part of it. It's also that if you have an area of expertise, you're very interested in giving that area of expertise to an institution. So we have 5 major criteria, and one is on governance. So if you're an expert in governance and you're on a team, governance will be assigned to you. Finance is certainly another one. As a college president, when I went to these visits as a college president, they always put me on finance because they know I needed to know how to manage finance. I could assess whether an institution was financially soluble or there were problems, etc. You might have a student affairs person on there. It really depends what kind of institution you're visiting and what standards they follow. In our case, at the Higher Learning Commission, you could be in one group, AQUIP, which is continuous improvement, another group, standard pathway, and you're visited on the 4th year and the 10th year, or you can be an open pathway. You are in open pathway, which means you're going to get less visits, less frequently, comprehensive visit in the 10th year, and a few years before that, you're going to have a very special project or focus on which you're working. What's your open pathway?
What's our project?
Yeah. Do you recall?
Yes, I do.
I can
We
give
ha-
you
we
examples
don't-
if you
we
don't.
haven't submitted
You're not
it,
there yet.
But we're close. Do you want to say?
You have time.
Sure. We're redesigning large lecture experiences. So, you know, I don't know how far you want to go, but kind of transforming that very passive experience of sitting in this large room listening to one where the students are actively engaged. And we're going to have a series of measures around that and feedback loops and so forth.
So you can see by that example that your institution has a goal. I assume it aligns with the mission and the strategic plan of the institution, and you want to put some energy into advancing that goal. So every year there's something called assumed practices, or when you have your comprehensive vision, you have to fill these out to say our baseline, here's where we stand, but your focus is here. Therefore, your team will be made up of people who have curricular development and those kind of experiences. So the motivation for being on the team is lending an expertise, meeting your colleagues, learning what happens, so when it happens to you, you're better prepared. That was, I'll admit, that was my motivation. I wanted to see, when I was at Antioch, I wanted to see what happens on the visits. I did it the entire time I was a president there. You can get called once a year, you can get called 5 times a year, you can move into other decision-making bodies, such as chair of a team. You can move into what we call the Institutional Actions Council, and that means there's been an issue and it's going to come in front of this group, and the school will have done its self-study, its team report, and then the Institutional Actions Council is an opportunity to be heard, and sometimes it's just a special hearing. And then it goes to our board. So our board is not like your university board. It's very different. First of all, it's not appointed by the governor or anything like that. It's made up of predominantly higher education individuals and some public members. So we always have to have a few public members. There are 19 members on the board right now. We can have a few more, but that's what we have right now. And the membership selects those. So we have a pretty complicated process for that, but the membership selects it, and we have to look at distribution of types of schools, appropriate representation, location geographically, et cetera. So it goes from the school does a self-study, a team comes in and does a team review of the institution after having read the self-study. If everything's okay, it's a desk review, and I send out a letter saying, congratulations, everything's wonderful. If there are issues that need to be addressed, if you're on a sanction, which I'll describe, then you move up the ranks. So I'll talk more in detail when I go to the class about these things, because I want to kind of get to some of the bigger issues, all right? First of all, what are the strengths of quality assurance? The focus on quality, the reason I deliberately put student in there is a lot of times accreditors or people at the state level are too distracted by policy or politics, and they might forget the reason we're there. And I always say, is it in the best interest of the student? And it's not an I organization, it's a we organization. So for example, back in the day when I was in Oklahoma, and we were very advanced in distance learning, and so was Wisconsin, of course, with radio and all kinds of extension, we had towers where we delivered across the state to prisons and other locations one-way video. This is for you who are young or thinking, really? But one-way video and two-way audio. And then it grew into two-way everything and very sophisticated, satellite, et cetera. But there was a time my staff came to me and said, it's a blizzard and we need the towers down. And we're going to send Keith out to work on the tower. And I said, well, there's like 2 things I need to ask you. One, is it safe? You know, let's go right to the Maslow hierarchy, bottom line, safety and security. Is it safe? It can be done. 2, is it in the best interest of the student? And if you can answer both of those, fine. But if it's not in the best interest of the students, if they're not going to be looking anyway, don't risk your life, all right? And I was in my 30s or less when I came up with that thought, and it's not original. It should be. Everything that we do should be in the interest of the students, which causes some of our staff a sense of cognitive dissonance as to, wait a minute, but our rule says this, and therefore here's the answer. And I'm saying, but you just closed a campus based on that, or you just closed a program based on that, and are there alternative routes, and how can we help the institution? But nevertheless, make sure you are in line with the standards. So if the standards are teaching and learning, and we go to an institution and they don't have an individual and therefore hopefully a culture across the campus of assessment, then how do you know your students have learned anything? There's been research recently, which is pretty devastating, which basically says there's a whole lot of people who go to college and the improvements over that 4-year period is pretty inconsequential. It's not as measurable as we would like it to be. And you could debate the research, but we're looking for that kind of movement. We're looking for what I experienced with my son. He went to Ohio State, and in went one person and out came another, and it was so measurable. And I remember I was at the president's home one time, kind of a well-known character, Gordon Gee, and I said, Gordon, my son is going to graduate from your institution, from the business school. What do you want to see? And the first thing out of his mouth is to serve the public good, to give back to the community, to be productive in his field. But he never said make a lot of money. Never. That wasn't anything he was talking about. It was like paying it forward and doing the right thing. And when my son came out, I said to Gordon, well, I don't know what you guys did, but I don't recognize him. You know, he's not that immature kid who went to college and then now he's this different person. In a larger sense of our standards, that's what we're looking for. What happens to the students when they're here? But we also look, assessment isn't just what goes on in the classroom. We look at student services, we look at the finance, governance. Governance is a big one because all you need is what a colleague once named one rogue trustee. Okay, I don't know if you've ever had any, so I'm not narrowing in on Wisconsin.
No comment.
Right, good plan. But there was a book written by a gentleman by the name of Terry O'Banion called The Rogue Trustee, and he was in the community college sector, and he went around and interviewed people and did minor disguises, but they were so minor that there were several people who turned them down. And all you need is one person who has an agenda that can just stop down how a board operates. And there are wonderful groups nationally that deal with that, like the Association of Governing Boards and ACCT, but we're also a party to that. So to give you an example, there was a state that was going to pass legislation because they had problems with their current coordinating board, all right? And they were going to pass legislation that the governor would appoint the legislator 3 commissioners, and that's all that would be over higher education. Now, does anybody see a problem with that? Okay, 3 commissioners over higher education. And we made a very big decision that we would actually write the governor and talk about the collateral damage, because there is an accreditation impact. If you do something like that, you're totally changing your structure and how you operate, and you can't just go out and do that on your own. Another part of accreditation is if an institution merges with another institution, if an institution buys one out, if it's in the for-profit, they all have to come through us for substantive change. And I always say substantive, but everyone in my office says substantive, so I'm trying to learn how, I'm practicing here. Change of control, all those kinds of things, we have to approve it. So we have a pretty busy schedule, as you can imagine. What keeps us up at night? What are the challenges, as your title said? Well, our challenge is people, one, not just in higher education, understanding the value of accreditation. I guarantee you that no student is going to pick their institution by reading a self-study, okay? Is the likelihood you want to read 600 pages? I'm not kidding, 50 pages of a study and 550 of attachments. Would that help you pick the University of Wisconsin? I don't think so, right? Well, there are those who think that all those reports, the self-study and the team report, should be made public. Now, what problems do you see as educators, those of you in here are educators with that? Do you see any problems with that? All right, your peer reviewers. Would you have the same kind of team report if you knew it were going to be made public?
I've seen I've seen self-studies and I've seen team reports that have been written as though self-studies that were written as though they were PR documents, which do not reflect the candid insight that a peer reviewer needs in order to evaluate an institution. And I've seen team reports that have been so temporized and provisionally framed and not actually evaluative that want to say it's useless to the institution. It doesn't provide enough candid feedback that could possibly help the institution improve.
So that's such an excellent point. Thank you. Because if an institution receives a report that's been whitewashed, it doesn't help the institution. So if you get a report that says this is good, but you have some areas that you need attention, it's much more helpful. And to meet our criteria, you have to have either met or met with concerns. And met with concerns is a red flag. There's work that needs to be done. And let me tell you, there are a lot of excellent institutions who have subcomponents that are met with concerns. If you miss an entire criteria, and there are several subcomponents under it, then you move to a sanction. And there are different kinds of sanctions. One is notice. And notice means we think you could become out of compliance. So get your act together and we'll see you in 2 years, all right? I cannot tell you, since I've been there, how many presidents have said, I'm glad you put us on notice because you gave me the hammer I needed to get some things done at our institution. The next one up is a term that institutions would prefer not to have because it's a common term, probation, all right? Unfortunately, we know a lot of that from athletics, but we also know it for other reasons. So if you're on probation, that means you are accredited, but you are at risk, and you've got 2 years to get off accreditation. You could drop down to notice, you could have it completely back to normal, or you could have your accreditation withdrawn. The worst is something called show cause, where you have a limited period of time to show us why not to withdraw your accreditation. One of the biggest accusations made by Congress and others is that there's not enough withdraw. There's not enough accreditors saying, we want to close your institution. But I had a list made up where we had 110 institutions in a 5-year period who saw the handwriting on the wall and chose to close on their own. So we didn't have to get to us putting a hammer down. They realized they were just going broke, or they had a singular major that no longer was current or popular or in demand. So there's all these different levels, and without the awareness of what's behind the scenes, it's easy to be critical. The biggest challenges for us are that we have the need to communicate better to the public. We need to own that as an organization that must have our watermark, or whatever it's called, on every website that says you're HLC accredited, et cetera. We don't say where, but on the website. What does that really mean? All right, what is accreditation? How can we translate accreditation to parents and adult learners, et cetera? We have an obligation to do that. It's easier for them to understand Microsoft certification, all right? Microsoft certification, if you have something like that, that means in Microsoft, you know how to deal with the servers and the networks, et cetera. But it's harder to explain accreditation. And I don't mean to diminish it when I say it's somewhat like the Better Business Bureau, or it's consumer reports. If you go into consumer reports prior to buying a car or a major appliance, you look for how many of those circles are filled in. Or So one of the things that is being suggested for accreditation is we have variable levels of accreditation. 5-star accreditation, 4-star accreditation. I'll tell you why I don't like that. The same thing as with the president's rating system. You are comparing apples to oranges in many cases, and the data is not reliable enough to do that, okay? So we're into our narrative evaluation, which is extensive, and we do need to find a way to translate that. We need people to understand who we are. The other pressures we're under, there are a lot of position papers by groups. One is a branch of the Department of Education that have different opinions as to what should happen to accreditation. Another group taking it over. It shouldn't be regional, it should just be national. The 7 regionals should all have the same terminology, all those kinds of things. So it's been a very interesting 7 months for me. And here are some of the things that we're doing. 1, we're doing a strategic plan. Did any of you get the survey and fill out the survey? Okay, so the first thing we did is we sent 7,000 surveys out to our institutions. That meant that you got it as a vice president, as a provost, as a accreditation liaison officer, as a president, et cetera. Some sent back 1 combined, others sent it individually. We have that all broken up so we can tell demographically. We got close to 2,000 of the 7,000 back, so it's statistically sound. We asked two parts of that survey. What are the national trends, and what does it mean for accreditation, and what do you want to say about us? And we ask about varying departments, technology, communication, et cetera. The number one thing that came out of the external was regulation, that you are being asked to have several criteria that are compliance criteria or standards that are passed from the Department of Ed to you, and you have to implement them. So for example, we don't say how many sexual assaults have you had on your campus, but we do have to have a report like the Clery Act to prove that you are taking, and what that means, the Clery Act is, it's public disclosure of the safety and how many arrests or any of those things have happened at a campus in the previous year. So there are rules like that. But we are also asked to ask things that we don't think really have a lot to do with quality assurance. And so when I was a president or I was in your shoes, there were times I didn't really like HLC because I thought they were pushing us to answer things that I didn't think were particularly related to quality assurance. And I don't say this to pass the buck, but it's not our choice. All right, we're being asked to do this. So the number one thing that came back from that survey is that you are being pushed away from quality assurance into compliance regulators. And we are not a regulatory agency, all right? It's not like when you go to get your license renewed and you can't even get through, right, to the DMV, or the lines are long, or you get so many connections on your phone. We're service-oriented, we're membership-oriented. On the other hand, another pressure that comes about, and comes very clear, is people want HLC to be the #1 regional accreditor. Of course, if they're in our region, they're going to want that. They want us to be thought leaders. Amen to that, because that's a term I've been using. So that when issues of higher education come up, we can be the speakers on behalf of the experts or call upon our membership. They want us to push for innovation and push as far as we can. They don't want us to stifle innovation. So back in the day, the Higher Learning Commission was much stricter on distance learning. In fact, it was kind of silly, in my opinion, and I'm big in distance learning for a number of decades. It's gotten much looser. It's basically show us you've done a good job, and then you report out after that, after a couple of years of a program, et cetera, versus every single program has to come in front of us. So there's been a lot of changes. We are getting much better, and we will get much better in our advocacy. We are following the recommendations of our institutions to say, get out there and talk about the importance of regional accreditation. Because despite anybody having frustrations with regional accreditors, they do not want the federal government to become their sole accreditor. If you've ever received in any format, or look at a grant application or a letter from the federal government, it's hard to even understand what the heck it says. And we don't want to turn into that kind of organization. We would like to, and we are beginning to emphasize best practices so that our institutions who are willing, and if you're coming to our annual conference, we actually have a document that will show this at the back of the resource guide we're passing out. It said these institutions agreed to be best practices if you want to call them on a variety of issues, okay? And we think that's important. I mean, there's so many things that you do well here. You're exemplary in that way. And if people want to talk to you about your flex program because they're trying to figure out what to do, they should be able to do that. And yes, you're under the pressure of financial cuts, but of course, that's very prominent in your minds, but the disinvestiture from states in higher education is 50 states worth pretty much, and it's very problematic. It's very problematic. So for example, when Obama recommends free community college, and now you know you've seen the second wave of that if you have a 2.5 and above, and you maintain that, which makes a lot of sense. It's the Hope Scholarship in Georgia's, I think, a 2.5 or maybe a 2.0 to get into it from, I'm not sure. But if you look at all of that, if the federal government doesn't pick up the bill and expects the states to pick it up, it's likely that will go nowhere, okay? It may go nowhere. And I'm not so sure the rating system is going to get traction and go anywhere, especially with a change of congressional leadership. So advocacy, strategic planning, our own continuous improvement. We look at you, we should look at ourselves and everything that we do. Competency-based education, direct assessment, I talked to some of you before this. These are hot issues. These are issues that are being discussed all the time. So I just wanted to give you, I want to leave some time for you to ask questions and interact. And, you know, anything you want to ask me. I'm a pretty candid person, so any concerns or issues or learning or anything you want to ask, I want to stop talking and leave that opportunity.
So Barbara, can you talk to us a little bit more about what I think I heard you talk about? There's a tension sometimes between what you're being required by the Department of Education to regulate versus that service-oriented kind of leverage point you want to be making.
Yeah, let me look in our resource guide, and I'm going to turn to the part on federal compliance, which is growing. So we have our own criteria, and we have, at the beginning of our criteria, we have values listed. And the values are such like a culture of continuous improvement, governance for the well-being of the institution. Those are just a couple. We have our criteria for accreditation. And as I mentioned, there are 5 and several under that for general accreditation. For AQIP, as you know, it's continuous improvement. And then we have assumed practices. And that's where you have to get right down and show you document all outsourcing services, you assure all data is accurate and complete. Those are basic. We don't ever have any big problems with that. We talk about faculty roles, and that's important, the engagement of faculty and students. And then we have, if it's in here, I'm going to take a quick look, a long list of, and here are the federal compliance issues. And I guess whether I find them or not, the bottom line is they are growing, okay? So let's take, for example, we do financial and non-financial indicators. So financial is pretty clear. There's ratio scores you can develop. I won't get into the math of all that. Non-financial in looking at a health are like enrollment changes, degrees awarded, full-time faculty changes, etc. When it gets to the federal government, they want to know default rate. And they want to get right down to how many of your students could not pay back their loans. And so, for example, I did find them. Well, they're wise not to give examples. They actually say go to the website. But the key issue that I'm trying to make is we are being asked more and more. So the best and newest example is there's something that the federal government puts out called a Dear Colleague letter, which is an interesting title because usually when you get it, like, ooh. So, Dear Colleague. And now they are interested in perhaps reviewing all competency-based education, which has, by the way, been around here. And my first job in 1977 for that many decades. And my comment is, okay, when will the federal compliance say we want to see if it's a large lecture or a small class? They're getting to that granular level. So that's our concern, that we may be asked to do things or to ask you to do things, more importantly, that we don't really see what that's got to do with quality assurance. When I was first engaged in distance learning, and this was in the 80s and a little before, I interviewed all the heads of the regional accreditors for a chapter I wrote in a Josie Bass book. And I'll never forget the discussion I had with one of them. They thought distance learning it was about distance learning and accreditation. They thought it was the most awful thing. And they asked all these things that they were telling us, all the ways they were going to control distance learning. And finally, it's nice to be young and free to say what you want. And you get that way again when you're older. And in between, it's a little quieter. And basically, I said, when was the last time you walked in a classroom? So the supposition that even at a fine institution like this, that all your faculty are excellent and every class you have, you're getting your maximum tuition dollar back as a learner is fallacious reasoning. It's not possible. There are some faculty who let classes out early. There are some who focus on teaching, that's fine. Some who focus on research, and you may not see them as often. There's all kinds of goods and bad acts that we do within a sector or on our own. We are human beings. But when you put that microscope on distance learning, that's just a little ridiculous because the work that went into distance learning as it evolved was actually quite strong and very interested in quality. Not the case across the entire country, all right? So that's the issue I'm talking about. I don't know what the next thing is, but I guarantee you the next innovation that comes out there will be more compliance that goes along with it than you want to be able to be innovative.
And that's precisely my question. Is there a group within the HLC that's thinking about what's coming down the road? And what time period should I say? The next 3 to 5 years, 3 to 8 years? There's so much change coming that it seems in accreditation, and I'm an engineer so I deal a lot with ABET, that you're always a couple of years back from where the pressures, the reality, the innovations are occurring. So how does accreditation, A, keep up, or B, kind of get ahead to where they're not just reacting?
Well, I'm glad you said that. The major motivation of our strategic plan is to be proactive and stay ahead of the curve. The horizon is likely 3 years because of the rapidly changing environment. I think to go beyond that would be somewhat made up,
Right.
much as our institutional plans are if you go much beyond that.
Right.
And then you have to explain why you didn't meet the enrollment of year 5 because you came up with it 6 years earlier, right? I asked our board just last week if they were in agreement that I could pull some funds down from somewhere and set up an innovation fund. They like that idea. It's kind of like the skunk works at Apple and all those places where you just maybe eventually have some people come in who are really innovative thinkers and you see what's down the pike. But our strat plan will project out some potential, but in this world that we live in, we really don't know what's next. I don't believe 5 years ago, we would have guessed about MOOCs, which is massive open online courses. We certainly wouldn't have guessed that they took off like a lion and went somewhat out like a lamb, that they were very popular in the beginning and that people found problems with them when I think there could be great advantages. It just depends how you use it. So yes, that will be a focus, and that's exactly what I meant by thought leader. And I welcome your input about how to do that. But I think having an innovation fund where we call in people and we have thought leaders come in and people are ahead of their time and say, this is our kind of brain trust. And how do we respond to that? So for example, in our strat plan, we've already compartmentalized about 43 trends, and there are going to be a lot more. And then we'll narrow it down to categories where there's 10 and the others are under it. I think it's very important that the next step is, so what? What does it mean for accreditation? A lot of people, when they do plans, go right from this is what we found to this is what we're going to do. I don't agree with that approach. I've done a lot of consulting in institutions about this, so we're going to pause our board, some of our membership, et cetera, and say, so what? So if you have this trend, and let me just increased accountability, all right? What does that mean for accreditation? That means you have to have evidence that the public is asking you to prove that there are more outcomes, movement, and success at your institution. So that's just one example. But we welcome your ideas, seriously. 55 individuals, if they were all geniuses, still don't have all the information of the world.
Well, there's acknowledging that we indeed can't predict the future very accurately. There's kind of two approaches. One is don't inhibit innovation, right?
Right.
And some accreditation rules probably do. And two, provide avenues for institutions to highlight their innovations that are some kind of plus point in the accreditation scheme. Without, trying to predict exactly what those might be.
I came from the non-traditional side of higher education, so I've always pushed the envelope a little bit. And you're going to find in the accreditation world a few different perspectives. One is, this is a standard, you met it or you didn't, end of story. To, well, if you invite me to your campus, I'll help you and we'll do some continuous improvement. To, I'm going to proactively say we need continuous improvement and come up with ideas. And we all will deal with that at every organization in accreditation.
Right.
The most consistent comment that came out from the what should we do differently is we want to see you more and we want you to be more proactive. What other questions? cognizant of your time.
Somebody who's that involved in, and many of the people around the table probably are, you speak a little bit about, outside of the regulatory nature of the federal government, other pressures on the kind of system of peer review that HLC experiences?
Yes. A false accusation that you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours is pretty common. If you've ever been on a team, it's more like I'll scratch your eyes out if you don't do the right thing versus you scratch. It's not, and we're very careful how we select it. So for example, if you're a peer reviewer and you're at Wisconsin, we may not send you to a small private university. We're going to be cautious to send you to institutions you would understand. And really the converse of that is more important. A University of Wisconsin, a University of Chicago, they want people on their team that understand them, okay? We also will not allow for conflict of interest. So if we have any peer reviewers who used to work at an institution or has ties or family members there, there's all kinds of ways we do everything we can to avoid that. That being said, there is a public perception, or at least a congressional perception by some, that peer review is bogus. And when Tom Harkin held his hearings a couple of years ago, he actually said to my predecessor, wait a minute, let me get this right. Your members review your other members. And the way he asked it, he built in his own, complete bias. And I so wish I could have been there and just said, wait a minute, let's step back a minute here, all right? I actually go to doctors, but I don't really think I can evaluate them, right? I told the Wall Street Journal, I don't know if this will be used, but I said I read a newspaper. Does that mean I can evaluate, can I be like an editor? We need our own people. We understand our business. So that's a big pressure we get. The other pressures we get are on costs. There are studies that go around and talk about the high cost of accreditation. We believe that at times that lumps in, you hired a director of assessment when you should have anyway. So if you look at the converse of that, if you don't have accreditors telling you need to do assessment, then you wouldn't have a director of assessment in that case, and you wouldn't have that charge, but you wouldn't have assessment maybe. So it's very hard to price it. Indirect and direct costs are hard to price it. So those are two big accusations. And the fact that the 7 regionals don't follow the same exact standards. That, as many ways as we justify that, that is very challenging to the public. We want our autonomy the same way your faculty do. So we can do what we think is best.
Do you think the nature of the pressures have changed at all over time?
Oh yeah, they've mounted, well, first of all, now it's tied to federal financial aid. Some of the pressures are, okay, we'll let go, you don't have to do compliance, and then it's your institutions, it's voluntary accreditation, but they have to get their federal aid arrangement directly with the federal government. So voluntary becomes considerably less voluntary, unless positioned very well, because there's no dollars attached to it, no loss, no measurable loss, reputational perhaps. Well, I know we're out of time and you have obligations, so time went quickly for me. I hope it was helpful.
Thanks very much, Barbara. That was great.